Just tell folks what you do for the Minnesota DNR.
Yeah, I'm the Minnesota DNR Lake Superior Fisheries Supervisor. So our office covers everything essentially from Duluth, Minnesota to the Grand Portage Reservation boundary, managing the charter, commercial, sport fisheries. We do a lot of assessment work on the lake. We do a lot of steelhead trap work on the Knife River here in Minnesota. So essentially everything and all fish, that's what we cover for the lake. So
Very cool. It's been a really good last, 12 to 16, 18 months for that area. You sent me a few notes and said it's been really good coho fishing up there. Tell me about what you guys have had going on.
yeah, it's been fantastic, man. I mean, we've had a 2022 year class of Cisco. That's the main native forage fish in Lake Superior. What we know about Cisco is we know they spawn every year. We know they hatch every year, but it's not that they always live to age one. If they live to age one, we know we'll see them as spawning adults. And what we've seen since about the late 1980s is a decline in recruitment events. So those young fish recruiting to be spawning adults. So we ran probably a good 15, 20 years of some pretty low Cisco densities. We weren't seeing really good recruitment, maybe a small year class once every 10 years. And, as your native forage fish in Lake Superior, that was causing some issues with, lack of food. Lake trout have switched over to rainbow smelt, which aren't native in Lake Superior in the 60s, 70s, 80s. But in 2022, we got a year class that we'd never seen before. It was bigger than the 1984 year class, which was the biggest we'd ever seen prior to that. And everybody put the feed bag on and started eating. So within a matter of about 2 years or a year and a half, we broke the Coho record 3 times. We're right now sitting at 12 pounds, 14 ounces as the state record for that. I saw some pictures and talked with some anglers that they would make tours fishing Lake Michigan, and then they'd run up and hit Lake Superior and make it back into Minnesota. And, they were reporting to me that they were catching bigger Chinooks on Lake Superior than they were Lake Michigan. So, just that Lake Superior is usually food limited, but the last 2 years it's been a perfect scenario of warm waters because typically we have cold water that salmon really don't like. But the last 2 years in particular, we've had really good warm water and a whole lot of bait fish swimming around out there. So, those salmon that, typically live 3-4 years, all they were doing was swimming around eating stuff. So it was neat to see that immediate response of cohos and Chinooks taking advantage of that forage source.
Yeah, what's going on with that? I mean, what has happened to create that extra forage there? You said warmer waters.
Yeah.
But what do you think happens with the winter that we've had this year going forward now?
Well, a lot of research has been put in really through decades of work on Cisco and why there's a lack of recruitment or consistent recruitment with them. And more recently, looking at this 2022 year class, some of our USGS researchers have noticed that June water temperature has to be cold. It has to be really cold. And that seems to be one of the best indicators of whether or not we'll get a successful recruitment event. And in 2022, that happened. We had really cold June water temperatures. And we got an enormous amount of Cisco production out of that year, which is great. The downside of it is those Cisco grow fast. So right now they're 2 years old. By age 3, the majority of those fish will be 12 inches, 13 inches long, and they'll start to be too big for coho and Chinooks to take advantage of them as a food source. So, they evolved with lake trout, Cisco did. So their, main job in the first 2 years of life is to get as big as they can so they won't get eaten by lake trout. So that's still what they're doing, growing really fast, providing a food source, for 2 years for salmon. And then right now we're looking at maybe 1 more year of some decent forage out there. And we'll be back to kind of where we were, previous to that big 2022 Cisco boom. Some years in our Silver Bay Salmon Classic up here on the North Shore, the winning Chinook salmon has been 3.5 pounds, right? So we're, especially on the North Shore, we're different than the Apostle Islands. We're different than Thunder Bay. We're about 12 different lakes in one on Lake Superior here. And on the North Shore, where our bathymetry is so steep, we're more like the ocean, where we're not very productive. We have these big upwellings and currents that create cold water. I've seen it drop from, mid 60s down to the mid 40s overnight up here. So, we're very different on the North Shore. But, lake trout have always been consistent for us. And this year for lake trout in particular, initial numbers anyway, we're seeing the best year anglers have ever had, which is great because, we had in our last management plan go round, we discontinued lake trout stocking, and there was quite a bit of hand wringing from anglers and constituent groups anytime you discontinue a stocking program. But all of our data and everything showed us that lake trout were on the right path and right on the right trajectory, and that's proven to be the case. We continue even in our surveys to see more and more lake trout over time.
You guys have pretty good natural reproduction there. What do you need for good natural reproduction for lake trout?
You know what? A good cobble, gravel, boulder substrate seems to be what they key in on. Some of these nearshore reef areas in Lake Superior, which we have a lot of on the North Shore because, we're primarily bedrock and clay right along the lake. That's why we have these beautiful scenic waterfalls all along our North Shore. So we have pretty much prime lake trout spawning habitat along the entire North Shore, which, shows up pretty much every year in our survey. We get really good recruitment year after year. We've been at steady recruitment with lake trout now for well over 15 years. So we think we've kind of reached an equilibrium where, we've got a big spawning stock out there, and the number of recruits or the number of juveniles that make it from year to year is really dependent on that predatory pressure from adult lake trout, which was really one of the reasons why we quit stocking our lake trout stocking program. Was what we were seeing was essentially every lake trout we were stocking into the lake was getting eaten by another lake trout. So, anytime you're wanting to make efficient use of anglers' license dollars, you don't want your stocked fish getting eaten by everything else out there.
Yeah, especially the thing that you're planting.
Exactly.
Tell me about that. I mean, I know that your area, North Shore of Minnesota, it is a lake trout area, and that's probably the thing that people, when they go fishing out on Lake Superior in that neck of the woods, 9 times out of 10, that's what you're targeting. We feel like there's been a resurgence in interest in lake trout all over the Great Lakes, but certainly in your area. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. I got to throw a plug in for there's a movie called The Fish Thief, and it's about sea lamprey and the Great Lakes and the control of sea lamprey and how it all started. And the story really focuses and highlights Lake Superior's time in this story, in that we were the only Great Lake to retain any wild lake trout population. And just about the time that we found a control mechanism for sea lamprey, they started essentially treating all the rivers and killing off sea lamprey. So we had a good start on rehabilitation because we maintained wild lake trout populations in certain areas of Lake Superior, which helped us to rebuild that and rehabilitate that population through time. So what we see now is, we think we're pretty much, at capacity, or where we've rehabilitated lake trout stocks to what we think they looked like pre-1940. So it's an incredible story of restoration and rehabilitation of, the top native predator in Lake Superior. And the really good thing about that is, we have a few different morphotypes or types of lake trout in Lake Superior. We've got the lean lake trout, which all the anglers go after. We have Siskoet, which are the fat or the deep water form, which aren't really good table fare. And then we've got humpers and redfins, and those are different lake trout on like offshore reefs and out near Isle Royale and that. And having that high biomass of different morphotypes of lake trout really puts downward pressure on our prey fish populations. So it's keeping smelt at relatively low levels. It's keeping a lot of other invasives at low levels. We do have alewife in Lake Superior, but not to the extent that, say, Lake Michigan has alewife. Very localized places, and typically our water is really too cold for good alewife production. Now that might be changing. We've seen this fall, we had seen water temperatures upwards of 60 degrees even into mid-September this year. So, water temperatures are definitely changing on Lake Superior. What's that?
Somebody's just talking behind me.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, I mean, water temperatures and changing. It's been great the last couple of years for salmon growth in that, but it could be an issue for alewife coming up if we really don't want to see a resurgence or a increase in alewife populations on Lake Superior. So
Yeah, you guys have been putting together, working on updating your management plan. That's something that
yep.
you built in 2016, and right now that's something you're working on putting together, kind of a new version of that right now. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
We are, yeah. I can't believe it's been 10 years already. It seems like it flew by. But yeah, it's really what drives all of our operations out of our Lake Superior office here in Duluth. We sit down and work with over 25 different stakeholder groups on the management strategies for the next 10 years, and looking back at the previous management strategies that we implemented. We'll evaluate that or those strategies, and each plan really builds off the previous plans. So I think we're in a really good spot, with what we've seen for lake trout and Cisco. We have a commercial fishery for Cisco. It's very important down the North Shore of Minnesota. And I think we're really good for our non-native salmon species as well. Steelhead, on the other hand, we've seen about a 60+% drop in steelhead numbers on our Knife River trap here. And it seems to be a lake-wide phenomenon. We talked with some of our counterparts around the lake, and kind of the consensus is we've been stuck in this drought flood cycle for 5, 6, 7 years now. And steelhead seem to be taking the brunt of that. And we've gone from about 1,000+ adult steelhead at the Knife River trap down to about 275 in 2024. So we've seen a pretty big decline in the numbers. We do have a stocking program for steelhead, and we are definitely going to be utilizing that and discussing with our stakeholder groups how best to utilize that stocking program going into the future, knowing what we know now about lake of steelhead populations and kind of the environmental impacts that we've seen. And a lot of anglers, a lot of folks out there don't really realize how little control managers really have over anything other than regulations, stocking fish, etc. The environmental conditions really drive a whole lot of what we see out there. So that's something that we can't control. It's more being able to react to.
Yeah, what do you think is going on with steelhead in Lake Superior?
Yeah, I think it's just it's that drought flood cycle. We had seen some incredible storms from about 2012 on, and it's happened in some of the worst times of the year. Like just post spawn, we've had some huge storms come through and essentially just flood out the rivers. Summertime, and then in the summertime we'll hit these drought periods where the Knife River is what we would consider our premier steelhead river, and in some years that drops down to about 3 cubic feet per second flow. Whereas, say, the Brule River in Wisconsin, it's 150 to 300 cubic feet per second all the time. So with our clay and bedrock substrates, we don't have good groundwater influence. We don't have good spring flows. So when we get those periods of no rain and drought, our streams really suffer. And I think that's really been what's going on with steelhead, at least on the North Shore of Minnesota here for the last 10 years.
One of the species that people really get excited about is coaster brookies, and that's something that you guys are working on as well. Tell us about this.
We are, yeah. We've done a lot of genetic work in the last 10 years, looking at brook trout populations on the North Shore here, looking at those big coasters that we see out in Lake Superior, the spawning populations that we see below barriers, and then our above barrier brook trout populations as well, to try to get an idea of where do those big brook trout in the lake come from. Are they spawning in the lake? Are they reproducing in the lake? Are they reproducing below barriers? Or are they just above barrier fish that drop below the waterfalls and head out to Lake Superior because the habitat is so poor below barrier waterfalls for us? So we've seen some really good numbers of coaster brook trout in the last few surveys that we've done. Upwards of 20, 22, 24 inches in some instances. Our crews did a really good job this year. We're always trying to do things differently and see if we can get better information. And our crews did an awesome job this year, Nick Peterson, of scheduling some fall time to do some shoreline electrofishing on Lake Superior, and they found incredible amounts of really nice sized coastal brook trout that we didn't know were spawning in nearshore areas of the lake. So that's definitely something in the next 10 years we're going to be looking more at and trying to get some more information. You know, there's nothing better than seeing pictures of anglers with, 3-4 pound coastal brook trout that they've caught. It's incredible and people love it. So
Yeah, one of the other things that you keep hearing about more and more, and we talked about a little bit on yesterday's show, is forward-facing sonar. And what I see that being used on Lake Superior in your neck of the woods, it's for jigging lake trout. Tell me about what you guys are looking at when it comes to forward-facing sonar and how it affects Lake Superior as a fishery.
Yeah, forward-facing sonar seems to be the hot topic everywhere you go, talking to anglers and fisheries managers. It's really too early right now, I think, to be able to make any really good decisions for us. We need some good data. But what we do know is, using forward-facing sonar is a great tool for targeting lake trout with jigging on Lake Superior. So we're going to be following up here in the next year or so, trying to get some research done on especially post-release mortality. There's been work done previously by Sean Sitar with Michigan DNR Marquette on post-release mortality of lake trout. And when you get those surface temperatures over 50 degrees, you can see post-release mortality upwards of 40-some%. So, we're talking about the efficiency of using forward-facing sonar, how many fish can be caught using forward-facing sonar, and really getting a good handle and some good data on post-release mortality, right? Because for the past 65 plus years, we worked on rehabilitating those populations of lake trout, and you see some really good numbers from folks using this technology, which is great. I think it's a great tool to get more people on the water, get more people fishing out there and utilizing the resource. But we have to be conservation minded as well when we look at it from a post-release mortality standpoint.
Cory, I really appreciate you joining us tonight, especially on a Saturday night. Appreciate your time and appreciate your insight. I always love to have you on, and thanks again.
Yep. Thanks for the invite.